With that, I'd like to call Dr. Fred Farias up here, who's the chairman of our Governmental Affairs Council. Fred has done a fantastic job. He is well connected in Austin and continues to play a vital role in terms of promoting McAllen and the RGV. And we're fortunate to have him involved in our community, but also giving back to his community. So if you would join with me in welcoming Fred.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Steve, and welcome everyone. Thank you for being here on behalf of the McAllen Chamber of Commerce Government Affairs Council Committee. It's my pleasure to introduce the panel this afternoon. I would like for Senator Chuy Hinojosa to please come forward. So let's give a round of applause to Senator Chuy Hinojosa, please. Thank you, Senator. Thank you. Representative Bobby Guerra, please come forward. Representative Sergio Muñoz, Jr., thank you for being here. Representative Ryan Guillen. Thank you for being here, Ryan. And earlier we had Representative Oscar Longoria. He had to leave because he had a meeting, so we appreciate him coming by as well. Our moderator this afternoon will be Sergio Sanchez, who is KURV Talk Radio. So Sergio, would you please come forward? Thank you for being here and agreeing to moderate. Thank you for being here. So again, we're going to listen attentively, and then we're going to have a chance for questions and answers. So again, thank you all for being here, and let's enjoy the program.
Thanks to thank you to the Chamber for the invite, gang at McAllen. Let me get something real clear now. Oscar had to leave early. I got first dibs on the pecan pie, okay? He made it very clear he wanted me to have the pecan pie before we leave. Again, thank you for the invite. All I got from the legislative session interviews, post-session interviews that we've been doing at KURV Radio is that it was a spirit of, in fact, Bobby said it again this morning, kumbaya, everybody getting along, loving each other. And as Representative Bobby said, hey, when you got money, hey, everybody's happy. You know, mama's happy, daddy's happy, the kids are happy. We got money in the state of Texas right now. There are overarching issues related to state budget, teacher pay raises, state funding for that, transportation issues. You know, we can get into all that a little bit. But because of our unique representation in the Rio Grande Valley, our lawmakers, they're I could say senior lawmakers. They've been there for a long time. I've been doing this radio gig for over 2 decades now, a quarter century, and I remember some of them being in power when I started. There are issues that are exclusive or unique to them, and I try to find a more professional term for it. I'll just call it what first thing popped into mind. I call it the toot your horn segment. I'd like to hear from each one of y'all specific legislation, bills that you introduced, not education funding, not transportation funding, not budget stuff, that something that you championed didn't make top of the hour news, didn't make front page news, that business folks and city folks should know about. I think we could learn something from it. I'll start with our senator, Senator Chuy Hinojosa. What do you say, Senator?
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting us here and be part of this panel. I think all of us are just happy to be back home. Many times, public forgets that when we come home, we got to make sure that certain things that make life bearable are working. For example, the plumbing, air conditioning, the roof doesn't leak. When you leave home for 5 months and you leave at home alone, a lot of things can go wrong. But let me tell you, for us, for me, I've been involved in quite a few sessions. Every session is a little bit different, and this session was also different, and it had its own personality. But the key aspect to this session was the last election that was held. You got to go back and look at what happened last session, where we spent a lot of time on wedge issues, divisive issues, and quite frankly, the voters got fed up with that, and they sent a very strong message to the legislature for us to focus on the bread and butter issues, the kitchen table issues, education, healthcare, property taxes, transportation, infrastructure, and that's very important, and that's exactly what we did. And if I may, the leadership, Governor Abbott really set the pace. Speaker Bonham, we had a new speaker in the House, and I'll let the House members speak to that. We also had Lieutenant Governor Patrick. They all were united in setting the priorities for this session. And that's important, because when you have the leadership united, it's much easier for us who do all the trench work to do our job and negotiate issues and work out differences. And we did just that.
All right. Representative Bobby, I know you and I talked a little bit about this, the toot your horn segment. Legislation bills that we didn't hear about necessarily in the news that you championed and you maybe got through.
Well, I was very happy to see that we were able to extend House Bill 2155, which is our ag inspection program. We all like our vegetables on our tables. We all want to make sure that H-E-B and other grocery stores have the necessary vegetables and fruits that we want to take home to our families. And you know, when Mexico built that super highway across Mexico to our ports of entry, we were not prepared, and I realized that. And so one of the first bills that I worked on when I first started in the legislature was on that bill, and it's taken me a couple of sessions, but we were able to finally pass it last session, and we were able to extend it again this time. $750,000 to go to our ports of entry that have fruits and vegetables coming in for our ag inspection program. That's so important to Texas, so many of our consumers, to the farmers that have farms in Mexico and in the United States, and I was very proud of that. But I want to say one thing, if I could, very quickly. You were asking about the flavor of the legislature, of the session, and indeed, you know, I think it was, as the Senator said, very much refocused this time on making sure we did things for Texans as a whole. And I got to commend Speaker Bonin. Speaker Bonin really set the tone in the House for us, and it was very, very clear from the very beginning. We're not going to get down and fight about stupid things. We're going to get down and talk about and get things passed that make our lives better in Texas. And Speaker Bonin had a lot to do with that in his assignments, committee assignments, and I just have to say, and really the leadership in Austin this time, a whole different flavor, as the Senator said.
Representative Muñoz, Tocayo.
Thank you. And I just want to add to what Representative Guerra mentioned in terms of international trade and how important that is, not only to us here locally, but as a state and really as a nation. And in conjunction with working with Representative Guerra on the reimbursement program for the ag inspectors, we worked very hard with TxDOT to make sure, and working with the Senator, that there was grant money in the budget through a rider to allow some of our international bridges to apply for that, to continue to expand and help them with their infrastructure projects and making sure that we can allow the commerce to work more effectively and efficiently, the cross-border traffic. Regarding legislation, I do want to mention two things, and one of them was balanced billing, which is something that the legislature had been working on for several sessions, and that was going into an emergency room or the freestanding ER and getting a surprise medical bill later. Initially, when you walk in, the ER telling you that your insurance covers certain procedures or certain medications, and then getting a bill later. And you end up into some sort of a dispute with your medical provider, the hospital, and the state of Texas in terms of trying to resolve that. And so we worked very hard to prevent the balance billing from happening, and also create a system where we can take the consumer out and leave that dispute between the provider and the hospital system or the ER, instead of making the patient continue to carry that burden and fight those disputes, which really become an economic question for them, and whether or not they will be able to do that.
Call that balance billing?
Balance billing,
Okay,
yes, sir.
that's going to kick in, right?
Yes, balance billing, and
September 1st?
also the Attorney General was given additional authority to investigate the price gouging, et cetera, that could occur in some of these places. And really, it's just an overall general consensus that we feel that we work on in trying to get patients more rights and access, not only to healthcare, but making sure that if they do have insurance, that they pay for the services that they're provided.
Thank you. This is the conversation version of maybe dipping into the mashed potatoes a little bit before you start eating the steak and potatoes. Well, we'll talk about the state budget and school funding here in a little bit. Ryan Guillen, legislation unique to you, something you champion, something personal that maybe did not get top billing.
Thank you, Sergio. First of all, thank you for having me and for including me every year here in McAllen. We really appreciate it. I'm from Rio Grande, for those of you who don't know me. I represent 10 counties south of San Antonio. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. You know, I try not to pigeonhole myself into one issue. I try to dabble in as many issues as I can and try to have an impact in different areas. It's hard to pinpoint something that I really thought was important. Instead, there's several, I guess, that we could point to, but we extended the 312 agreements that were set to expire. Those are the incentives that local governments are able to give big projects, and those are, if you see all these wind turbine farms that have popped up in South Texas, 312 agreements were very, very important to get those there, and so we extended the ability to do those agreements for 10 years. So I think that was very important. We finally, you know, we had passed a bill several sessions ago, to dedicate the sporting goods sales tax to state parks and historical sites. But when we passed that, somebody in an omnibus bill undid the language in a bill that passed like 3 days after ours did, and so they undid it in the same session that we did it. And so again, we got it done this session, but it will be on the constitutional amendment ballot, and so that's very important for our state parks. We got $250 million for roads in the energy sector counties. I represent the Eagleford Shale, or part of the Eagleford Shale, and so that's, you know, there's a lot of activity that is damaging our roads. If any of y'all have been to West Texas, they're having a tremendous problem with that. So we got to fund this session to help in that regard. Work with Eddie Lucio, the senator, on EDAP, and Senator Hinojosa as well. EDAP funding, I think that's a huge thing for us here in the valley and on the border. EDAP helps finance water and wastewater and other drainage projects in our communities, particularly in colonias and in older type communities as well, rural type communities. And so there's a $200 million constitutional amendment that needs to get passed. That's going to be a big deal that we need to really work hard to get passed in the constitutional amendment election. And one other thing that I think was very significant is we did away with the driver responsibility program, which, for those of you who are aware, it was a program back, about 15, 17 years ago. We had a shortfall. Instead of raising taxes, the state implemented the DRP, which was fees on traffic violations, and it put people into a kind of a revolving cycle of debt, and so we finally were able to do away with it this session, and we were very happy about that.
I wanted to hear from all four of you, from your perspective, what changed in Texas education funding, good and bad? Senator?
Well, let me, if I may, Sergio, I guess set up the big picture. That's important to understand where we're coming from this session. Number one, historically, dealing with public education funding, we've always taken a Band-Aid approach. And it's gone up to the Supreme Court several times, and the Supreme Court said it was unconstitutional. Well, this last time, they didn't say it was unconstitutional, but said it was not functional or dysfunctional. It wasn't working. And we received all the complaints by property taxpayers, how rapidly the property taxes for school districts was increasing. So when we went and started this session, we had several priorities. Number one, reform public school finance, and we did that. Number two, deal with property taxes. We did that. Number three, deal with the issues on the damage caused by Harvey, and we did that. I will tell you that we also focus on teachers. And on education, we added $11.5 billion additional funding to public education. Our budget this session was $250 billion. The supplemental bill, Senate Bill 500, was $10 billion. There's $260 billion that we had to work with. In the meantime, our commitment to the public was fixed education. So we put in quite a bit of money to the point that we gave teachers a pay raise. On the average, about $4,000 per teacher, including counselors, nurses, and librarians. We also put in $5 billion plus to lower property taxes. So we were focused on property taxes. We put a cap of 2.5 on property taxes for school districts. Every time you get your property tax notice, you'll see that the biggest hit comes from public schools because the state was not doing its fair share of funding. So we increased our share of funding from 37% to about 45, 46%. Historically, the state pays about 50%. The federal government pays about 40%. I'm sorry, 10%. The property taxpayers pay about 40%. But the 40% kept going up, that now it was somewhere in the 60%. So we took action on that. Along with that, we also increased funding per student from $5,140 to $6,180, almost $1,000 per student increase in funding. We now fund full-day pre-K. And as those of you who are teachers will know that pre-K is so important because once they get to beginners, first grade, they at least know how to read and write so they can get ahead on their education.
If I could ask, do you think that the president's spending on education is sustainable? Let's say the economy changes a couple of years from now, and we're not getting royalties and all that. The revenue's different in the state of Texas. Is it sustainable? Can the state of Texas keep paying for that $5 billion difference, for example, in the property tax, the maintenance fees that are taxes being collected, and the state is subsidizing?
Well, the funding system was falling apart, quite frankly. It was not sustainable. At some point, the state share would be about 10%. And all that cost will be shifted to your local property taxpayers. This is why, and we had to do it now because we had the money, we had the funds. We were very fortunate that we have a very strong economy, and we are an oil gas strong economy, that we even had $15 billion in a rainy day fund. So we combine all that to focus on those issues that we kept getting feedback from our voters, constituents to fix, and we did that. But you know, along with that, it's important to understand that that's not the only issues that we address. We put in $3.5 billion to deal with flooding. As you know, just a couple of days today and yesterday, we had a lot of colonias, a lot of neighborhoods flood. And we put in money to address those issues, not only in terms of Hurricane Harvey, but also a flood plan statewide. So we are really focusing on a lot of those issues.
The way state lawmakers funded education in Texas, and this is for anybody, you guys can jump in.
Can I say one more point?
Yes,
it's
sir.
important. And see, to make education, public education finance work, we had to pass Senate Bill 2. which dealt with property taxes. School districts, 2.5. And one of the most difficult issues was trying to also cap property taxes for counties and cities. And we capped that at 3.5. But it's not really a cap. What it is a trigger. If your city or county wants to raise property taxes above 3.5, they have to get the permission of the voters. And quite frankly, a lot of people were losing their homes because they couldn't pay the property taxes. And with the teachers, this is another big issue. Our retired teachers. Our retired teachers are on fixed income, but the healthcare cost continues to increase. And the pensions were not stable. So we put in over $1 billion to keep healthcare costs from increasing for retired teachers, plus gave them a 13 check, kept at $2,000. So we have moved very aggressively in education. So for us, we and the Valley delegation worked very well with our members. And it wasn't until towards the end of the session that we finally put it all together because so much money was involved that we were somewhat concerned that we would be able to sustain that into the future. It wouldn't be a one-time funding. And I could go on and on about the increase in funding for the medical school. We went from $56 million to almost $69 million. We increased funding for UTRGV by, I think it's over $10, $12 million, not including the medical school. All across the board, we dealt with a lot of our infrastructure issues. TxDOT funded $31 billion. So for us, it was a very good session, a very positive session in addressing many of the issues that we face here in the Valley.
We sure could use a gavel up here. Maybe I could just strike it a couple of times. Does the senator yield the time back? Yes. Right.
Well, you know what
There's some
happens is in
delicious
the Senate,
chicken for you to enjoy
we
over
don't
here
have
if you like.
time limits in the Senate. I know they do in the House. I meant to filibuster, okay?
Gentlemen, the way Texas funded education, does it keep Texas out of the courts? Are we done? Are we good with the courts now? They're going to say funding is unconstitutional, or are we good now?
Well, personally, I think, first of all, let me say this much. We have to thank in this state the teachers, the retired teachers, the educators for making their voices loud and clear. We really do. Because we heard you in Austin, Texas, and we heard you throughout the state of Texas, and that was so, so important, a big driving force for us funding education as we did. But you raise a good point. Are we going to be able to sustain these type of infusement of money? We're going to have to find a new revenue source, a new funding source in this state. We were very fortunate this time that our oil and gas revenues, folks, the rainy day fund comes from oil and gas revenues. And, a few years ago we got hit real bad, but it came back. It came back real strong. But we've got to find new funding sources so we can continue to provide Texans the quality education, the quality of health care in the communities that we all live in. And so that's going to be one of the main things that we're going to be focusing on is making sure that we look to the future because that's our job and see if we can figure out solutions for future funding. But again, I have to commend our educators for making your voices so loud and clear. And throughout the whole, I got to tell you, this session, as I told you, it was kind of more of a kumbaya session. And in any household, when you have money, people get along, everybody's happier, everybody's smiling. But there's going to be a day we're not going to have money, so we've got to figure this out.
Representative Muñoz and Guillen on the education budget, just your thoughts.
Well, I think as was mentioned previously by the senator and representative, the investments had a substantial impact in terms of making the system sounder. When you look at teacher retirement, that was one of the challenges that we continue to face time and time again, which was trying to make the system actuarially sound because of the longevity and being able to provide the benefits to the people that we're responsible to. So we were able to utilize funds, as we mentioned earlier, because we have the revenue available to make those one-time investments and to help them with the co-pays in terms of the insurance and the 13th check that the senator mentioned. as well. Now, when you look at education funding as a whole, it is going to be something that has to be looked at session by session because of the revenue and because of the responsibility that we have as a state to make sure that we're meeting our local school districts halfway in terms of the funding. So right now that we have it, it's a lot easier to do, but the economic recessions that we feel in the nationwide will impact us here on a state level, even on a local level. And I think the sustainability is always going to be a question session after session. But we're putting the mechanisms in place, I think, going forward to where we're going to be able to meet that responsibility. In addition to the funding, the additional funding that is going to be sent to our local districts for the pay raises and in terms of making sure that more of that money goes into the classroom. One of the things that we're also going to look at, I'm sure very stringently, is how did the local districts use that money, that additional money, before we start next session? And that was something that was put in the education bill to make sure that before we start the next legislative session, we get an accountability from the school districts as to how that additional money was spent. Because if we're telling our school districts that we're giving you more money for our teachers, we want to make sure that our teachers get the money.
Representative Guillen, the 2.5% cap on the increase, more than just, let's say, an elected body increasing the rate at 2.5%, but the values going up by more than 2.5%. You think that puts the hamstrings, budget proposals, and the needs of maybe some fast-growing communities?
Of course. Anytime you cap anything from going up more, it's going to restrain you from that money. But of course, there was an outcry across the state on property taxes and how much people are paying and how much values are increasing. And this, of course, what was happening is you had local taxing districts that are not necessarily, because most of them don't raise taxes from year to year. So their tax amount, the taxable amount, wasn't going up from year to year. But what was happening is that values go up, and so their revenue goes up, and they're only capped at an increase of 8% in revenue from one year to the next, and this lowers that cap to 3.5%. So yeah, it keeps them from that additional money in years where values went up enough that they could have gone up to an 8% increase in revenue. Now they have tools. They can they can go to the voters. They can raise their taxes. They can all of those things. But of course, yeah, will it restrain them from doing things that they were able to do before this bill? Yes. Going back to education, my colleagues pretty much hit all the highlights already. I think the only one I guess I would talk about is we put in some money towards making schools safe. And with what happened in Santa Fe over near the coast last year, that was a big issue. I think we put a $100 million fund to help schools get some grants to harden those schools.
Eddie Lucio, of course, he championed that for us as well. But maybe if you can touch on that, we can work our way down and maybe open up to the floor if any folks have any questions on school security. Go ahead, finish your thought, Ryan.
Well, and in terms of sustainability, the question of sustainability, obviously not. If our economy doesn't stay strong, if oil and gas prices aren't stabilized and stay where they're at or go up, if we don't continue to grow as a state, if people stop moving to Texas at the rate that they're moving to Texas now, if trade is interrupted between Mexico and Texas, so many factors are at risk, of course, of not being able to sustain what we spent this time. Obviously, we had a surplus, and we spent the whole damn thing, and so Are we going to be able to do that in the future? Well, it's going to depend on if we have a surplus next time or not, or if we have the same amount of money come in, or at the same amount of money plus growth come in or not. And will it happen? Well, if you look in the over a historical perspective, you don't have a continuous increase over the years, and so yeah, this is going to be a challenge that we're going to have to address in the future.
Real quick on security. Yes, sir.
Let me address that, because on the Senate side, we actually had a revenue committee where we look at how to raise the funds to make the investments we make in education sustainable. We only need about $10 billion. Keep in mind that our economy has many sources of revenue. So we're looking already. We're going to come up with a source of revenue, but quite frankly, we ran out of time. Towards the end, we were real pressed just to get the public finance and school formula structure in place. Otherwise, we would have come up with a way to deal with that. But going back to schools, because this is very important, we invested $300 million in public schools. $100 million to harden our public schools buildings and campuses. But more important, the $100 million that we provided schools with for mental health issues, to identify our children in school who may have problems, suicidal problems, they may hurt themselves or hurt somebody else, and identify them at a very young, early age so we can get them the help they need. So we are responding to the needs that are being requested by the general public. The funding, this is also important to understand that the difference between the jurisdictions, 3.5, on the average, most cities and counties don't go about 3.5. But we have some outliers out there that really go 8, 9, 10%, that are really causing a lot of the issues. But our public schools, the reason it's important to stay at 2.5 because it forces the state, us, who have a lot more sources of revenue, to pay our fair share of funding of public schools.
Folks, I'm going to open up the floor for questions. So you think about something that has not been addressed and really needs to get a hearing, either real estate, property ownership, 2A, border things. So think about it. Let me throw a joker's wild question here real quick for everybody to answer, and then I'll come back to you. I might even run over to you and see you here real quick. If you kind of addressed the issue, you ran out of time here at the end. That was going to be one of my questions. If you had a chance to add something to the state budget, what would it be?
Well, I will add one. We are actually, there's so many funding and legislation that we passed that is so important. But one of them had to do with rape kits. Okay? Here in Texas, we don't have the capacity to process all the rape kits from women who get raped. So you have rape kits that have been sitting there for 20 years, 15 years. So this year we appropriated $54 million to increase capacity for our crime labs to be able to process and all the rape kits. It's really amazing. We found out from different jurisdictions that they were just sitting there on the shelves, not being addressed. So we took action on that, and to me, that was very important. In general, with mental health, we provided about $7.3 billion. This is mental health across the board. So we've been very active in addressing different issues. Our rural hospitals right now, really many of them are shutting down in the rural areas. So we are funding, and I can't remember the exact amount, but it was at least over $300-400 million just to try to help them sustain and keep the doors open.
Okay. Jeannie gives 3 wishes, so you got yours 3, and let's go over to Bobby.
Well, the senator talked about the rape kits, and I have to comment about this, and I have to really thank Victoria Nieve from Dallas, who really championed that bill in the House of Representatives. She has been fighting that issue since she got to the House. Very proud of her, and that's a significant bill in the state of Texas to address this issue. So I wanted to make that comment. Victoria Nieve from Dallas.
What would you add to the budget? If you're given a chance, what would you add to the budget?
I'm sorry?
What would you add to the budget, Bobby, if you're given a chance?
What was the question?
Yeah, what would you add to the state budget if given a chance?
Oh, what would I add to the state budget? Quite frankly, to continue to be able to fund our public education. That, to me, is so, so important for the future of Texas.
Okay, Muñoz?
Well, I guess I thought your question was what would you add to the legislature? So if you could add something, I would add more reasonable, rational people.
You know, and along that line, let me say this much, and I've got to say this. This Valley delegation, on real important issues, we get together, do we not? And we work together, and we consult with each other, and we're pretty much on the same page.
And the only reason I mentioned that is because, I mean, at the end of the day, we get
We are rational, right?
Yes. Well, I'm not talking about the panel up here. Okay?
Why you keep looking at me, man? What's the matter with you?
Well, the only reason I mentioned that is really, I mean, you know, when we're there in session and even during the interim, I mean, our job is to find solutions, right, to the challenges that we face. And that has no partisan line, that has no, you know, gender, no ethnicity. I mean, it's about solutions for people. And I think this session is one of those examples where if you put that aside and you look at the betterment of a whole, you're able to get there. But if I were to add something to the budget itself, I think it would just be additional revenue going forward, because we did have investments because we had a surplus and we used a substantial amount of money from the Economic Stabilization Fund, which was our rainy day fund, to the tune of more than $6 billion overall. So going forward, without that money there, we're going to need to make sure that we can have that other source of revenue to fill those gaps, and that's what I would add to the overall budget.
Okay, final call before we go to the floor for some questions. Ryan, what would you add to the state budget?
Well, that's a tough question. That's like picking one of your kids as your favorite kid over the other. But you know, I guess if I had to pick, I would say that I'd add more money for infrastructure and particularly drainage infrastructure. Right now, we're having, you know, we've had, I think, 3 or 4 500-year floods in Texas in the last 3 or 4 years, which is just out of this world, and it's a tremendous problem. We did make a big investment, and we'll see what kind of impact it'll have in our communities, but I'm sure it's not going to be enough at the end of the day. I guess I'd also say, you know, a guaranteed teacher pay raise that, you know, a solid amount that at least keeps us at the average across the country. I'd also say I'd guarantee retired teachers their benefits so that they don't have to worry about it every year after they're retired, whether or not they're going to get what they thought they were going to get, and then, et cetera, et cetera. I could go on and on and on and on, but you know, I guess those are the ones I'd mention right now.
How about additional funding for our bridges, the infrastructure of our bridges and the commerce we have with Mexico? That is tremendous benefit to our economy in the state of Texas.
All right. Well, it is at the appointed hour. I want to again recognize our sponsors, the City of McAllen, D. Wilson Construction, IBC Bank, McAllen Hidalgo and Anza Lewis International Bridge, McAllen Economic Development Corporation, Texas Gas Service, and UTRGV. Feel free to take this with you. This is a legislative report. You're not going to find this anyplace else. It's not going to be e-blast out to anybody, so this is the final report. Give our legislators a round of applause, and very much appreciate the time that they take away from their family. And then one final round of applause for the Radisson Hotel, brand new hotel reopened. They did a fantastic job. You all have a great afternoon.